We tend to make a lot of assumptions about human nature, about how we view the world or should view the world, that are very weird in a historical context, not just weird as in odd, but also weird as in Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic, which I'll get back to this book in a moment. But weird peoples, weird cultures are outliers within state societies based on grain agriculture, which is almost all people today live in such societies, but for most of human history, the vast majority of people lived in no such thing. And I've talked about that was one of my criticisms of Jonathan Haidt in The Righteous Mind. So James Scott, in The Art of Not Being Governed, he talks about the hill peoples of Southeast Asia who have a variety of ways of living, but the social organization is very different from the grain-based agricultural societies. And he has another book against the grain, and his three most famous books, that's his third most famous, his most famous is Seeing Like a State, and that was first, then this one, then Against the Grain. They become progressively easier to read as he gets better at writing for a popular audience. But I think this one is the most overall interesting of his books. And so I mentioned in my video on scientific memoirs 4 books by 3 authors on people who lived among non-state-based societies that were not based on grain agriculture. And so 2 of these were Tim Flannery's books about the Southwest Pacific Islands and about New Guinea. And both of these cultures tend to do some agriculture of typically bananas and tubers. So you can't have the same centralization of power because bananas and tubers can't be stored in central warehouses the way that grain can be. And so these societies have remained much more fragmented and small scale. They also, both of them, cannibalism was historically common. So they still did a lot of hunting, including of humans. And there is this very, I've talked about before, the distinction between primary and secondary narcissism, where primary narcissism is just fundamentally not recognizing other people as people, and then you recognize it, and then secondary narcissism is you find reasons to justify that behavior. And so the way he talks about both of these cultures, it seems like it's sort of a state of primary narcissism of outsiders. They might have 2 legs, but they're not really people, or at least the societies who live and behave in this way. And so that is, obviously, that's a huge cultural difference in norms from how we operate. And Flannery has argued that a lot of the stuff that he talks about is unique to Melanesia, so New Guinea and the Southwest Pacific and the Molucca Islands. And it hasn't been observed elsewhere, but of course, we also, grain-based agriculture has spread so widely that we only have a few societies that really are outside of states based on grain agriculture. And true hunter-gatherers, so talked about these 2 books in that same video, Don't Sleep, There Are Snakes by Daniel Everett, and Affluence Without Abundance by James Sussman. This is Everett about his life among the Piraha, Sussman about his life among the Bushman people, who, that is one of those words that when I use it, more liberal-leaning people will be like, oh, isn't that politically incorrect? And I'm like, it's considered politically incorrect, but according to Sussman, the Bushmen prefer that term over the Khoisan term that is preferred by academics. So I use Bushman, even if it's a little politically incorrect, on the basis that supposedly they prefer it. Anyway, so Sussman and Everett, there are differences between these societies, which, I mean, one's in the Amazon jungle, one's in the Namibian desert, but they're both hunter-gatherer societies, and they both are remarkably individualistic. Like, people will often say, like, weird cultures are unusually individualistic, but it's a secondary individualism based on assumptions of collective responsibility that are not really present in, honestly, any of these societies in any of those 4 books by these 3 authors I mentioned. And I've heard similar accounts from people who have worked among other groups, like Australian Aboriginals, before the Australian government sort of forced them to settle, and among the Eskimo. That's another one of those terms that the Inuit, who are the majority of Eskimo, prefer Inuit. The Yupik, who are the majority of American Eskimos, prefer Eskimo. So I use Eskimo as an American because it's like, imagine it's like Americans, just call everybody American in North America, or at least like Canadians, and it's like, no, like if we had a term that was a little bit politically incorrect, but referred to both Americans and Canadians, even though they're like 10% of our numbers, I would be using that. Of course, North American isn't that way. But anyways, based on accounts both in these books and what I've heard from people working among other hunter-gatherer or groups that are not hunter-gatherers but are not state-based, well, pastoralists, so herders, tend to be much more communal even than grain-based agricultural societies a lot of the time. But primitive agriculturalists and hunter-gatherers tend to be sort of this primitive individualism, but it also comes with a strong degree of egalitarianism. And so with the Piraha, at least as ever presented, they do seem to have sort of a conception of what I made is mine in a way that sounds kind of like the libertarian theory of homesteading, which I have issues with even as a libertarian. Whereas Sussman is like, if you have something that is not like a very specific handful of things that everyone is allowed to have as their own, it's anyone's right to just ask for it, and you have to give it to them as a means of sort of enforcing equality. And you also have a culture of sort of putting down the most successful hunters to try to keep them from getting too big for their britches and becoming headmen, which I don't think Everett described, but it sounds like the tall poppy syndrome that we have in weird cultures, or crabs in a bucket, that you have in a number of cultures, not just weird cultures. And so weird cultures, so you get back to sort of an individualism that Henrik argues is based on sort of the destruction of the extended family. And so one thing about all of these groups that I talked about is all of them were exposed, well, I think Pacific Islanders didn't really have as big a problem with European diseases, but the Bushmen and the Amazonian Indians did. But even there, like, it seems like they're not based on the same extended family dynamics that pastoralists and grain agriculturalists tend to be. So weird societies are weird in a lot of ways, but individualism and rationalism tend to be sort of the two biggest. And there's I think it's the Wechsel-Engelhardt scale that plots them on 2 dimensions. And one of the criticism is this could just be 1 dimension. And if you look at it, like after Christian countries, Confucian countries, which are also generally like a Confucian, Taoist, folk religion, and Buddhist synthesis, tend to be the next weirdest by Henrik standards. And I've said I'm going to have a video on the similarities between dynastic China and our countries. But those countries still have the extended family structures that were destroyed in Western countries by, Henrik argues it was the Catholic Church, but I've seen other books that argue that actually, if you look at like the archaeology and ethnography of like the Celts, it seems like Western and Central Europe actually destroyed the extended family structure early, or at least some groups did. But the assumptions that we make of basing things on sort of complete atomization of the individual and rationalism, and we can eventually know everything through rational inquiry, these are presuppositions of weird cultures. I've noticed universalism, moral universalism, epistemological universalism too, but especially moral universalism of everybody should have the same morals I do. Like, how could any good person, anyone who sees themselves as a good person, not have these morals, tends to be a big part of these cultures as well. And like a lot of these things tend to go together. And I think one thing for me is I come from a rural area, and a lot of stuff that we associate with weirdness is also specifically urban. And so if you look at like parts of Scandinavia that are more rural, you see things that are, I'll maybe make a video about that, but I have to actually write down and remember exactly the examples I was thinking of, because right now it's slipping my mind. And so that might be why I've been less full into some of these things, but I have still assumed moral universalism, rationalism, and individualism. I've just taken that for granted for most of my life, and I've had to challenge that. And John Gray, who is behind me, he has been a major factor in that. And I still, obviously, my preferences lean towards that, but I think it is helpful to understand just how diverse human cultural views of the world have been, epistemologically and morally. And again, going back to like taking it for granted that cannibalism of other groups is fine, sort of the extreme example of this, but the extreme individualism of the Piraha and the Bushmen also sort of falls into that. And then the extreme communalism of the pastoralists as well. Like, if you look at the Bible and the commandments in the Old Testament, like, those are pretty consistent with ethnographies I've seen of nomadic pastoralist civilizations that is very heavily based on the clan and extended family system. And I think, to a substantial degree, probably family systems and social organization does drive a lot of this eventually. And that's one thing I'm sort of curious about in China, is the Chinese government has tried very hard to destroy family ties under Mao, and then the one-child policy has basically destroyed extended family networks. So is China going to become much more of a Western country, like stereotypically, in the near future, compared to Taiwan, Japan, Korea? Oh, and another thing that I wanted to mention, one thing that I noticed is in Western countries, we tend to understand children as people who should be valued members of the family. And that is a new development since the Industrial Revolution, having fewer children. And before then, children were in agricultural societies, if you look at developing countries, often still are treated as hands for labor on the family farm. And when you had higher child mortality, you got less attached. But it's interesting because the way, I forget if Sussman described this with the Bushmen, but certainly Dan Everett with the Piraha, children are treated like young adults, like even before puberty to some degree. And certainly after puberty, it's just, okay, yeah, you're an adult now, do whatever. And so this idea we have of, yeah, children are people worthy of respect, but it's also developmental stages, which I think is the correct understanding. But it's also an understanding that depends on the luxury of having the resources to invest in your children and the luxury of not having the demands of, okay, I just need to treat my children as a labor force, and the benefits of modern medicine reducing child mortality rates. And that is a new development. And another one is literacy. Like, literacy changes the brain, which I think there's probably books and there's certainly papers that I should actually read more about it, because it's something I've thought about in terms of if literacy changes the brain, how much does hyperlexia and how much of that is causal. But I wonder if literacy is a contributor to especially rationalism. I saw someone argue recently that before literacy, it wasn't even possible to have a belief in rationalism because until you actually write down your arguments, you can't pin them down in the same way. And I don't know if that was necessarily true, because I think like the Greeks were still mostly oral, and they were sort of the founders of rationalism in the West. But they did have writing, and the schools of Chinese thought that I think of as rationalists also have writing. So I want to talk about literacy and thinking about children as well. Oh, and one more thing that I forgot to mention about weird psychology, even as compared to other grain-based agriculture state societies, is that weird societies tend to classify things based on perceived lineage, taxonomy, in a very absolute sense, compared to how pretty much all humans throughout history have done so. There are at least 2 well-known YouTubers who have made videos claiming, technically humans are fish and birds are reptiles. And I'm going to make a video at some point going into more detail about why that's wrong, or at least why that's a very non-useful take. But that comes from believing that phylogenetic taxonomy is the only valid way to define groups of animals. And it's interesting. So this book by George Lakoff, which interestingly, someone identified on my shelf, I think it's the only book anyone has. No, actually, Arthur Kostler, people have identified too. But in this book, he talks about how the Diarbal Aboriginals of Australia, and he was working with them after the Australian government had forced them to settle, so he was observing, like, there were changes in the language between the older generations who grew up as hunter-gatherers and the younger generations who grew up under the influence of Western urbanized Australian culture. But this term, this category, women, fire, and dangerous things, is because basically this language, Diarbal, has, I think it's 4 classes of nouns, one of which is based on men and things associated with men, and 1 women and things associated with women. And then it expands as sort of a familial resemblance from there, as well as dividing things often in ways that are counterintuitive so they're memorable, which fits in kind of with my video about with frameworks. If I know something seems counterintuitive to a framework, I remember it better. And I want to actually reread that part at some point. This is a really interesting book. Unless you're really into semantics, I would not read the last part of the last chapter. But if you're even a little into linguistics and semantics, I recommend this book. But it also is interesting as sort of a psycholinguistic anthropology, I guess I would say. And this whole thing about familial resemblances, sort of clustering things together. I'll have video on definitions and how the way we define things is weird, but I just wanted to talk about this insistence that we have on assuming that things must be sort of taxonomically pure and consistent is another very weird aspect of our psychology. Only someone from a weird culture could insist that humans are actually fish, because taxonomically we are phylogenetically closer related to lobe-finned fish and lungfish than lungfish and lobe-finned fish are to other fish. So anyways, I wanted to talk about this quickly because I think it's interesting, and I don't really have a specific point beyond just it is amazing to me how many people, and I've had this to some degree. I think because I come from a rural area and then I went to school with urban people, I recognize some pluralism of viewpoints, but for me, it still took way longer to realize just how diverse views like that can be. And I think living in Turkey also helped, because Turkey, initially my impression is a lot of things in Turkey seem superficially similar to the United States relative to Europe, which Europeans sort of take as the baseline. And so when they complain about how Turks think about things, I'm like, oh yeah, Americans do too. And then as I spent more time in Turkey, I'm like, oh, they are sort of superficially similar, but for very different underlying reasons. So anyways, wanted to talk about that. Thanks for watching. I'm Magpie. This is Leela, and we'll see y'all in the next one.